now what we're going to do is change our attention. Thus far, we've been looking at the peaceful side of the civil rights movement, the nonviolent side of the civil rights movement, the actions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We've looked at CORE and SNCC. We've looked at the peaceful nonviolent protests and the use of the court system to get change within society. We're going to change our attention now. Instead of looking at the nonviolent side and the peaceful side, we're going to look at the more radical side of the civil rights movement. And I prefer the term radical to violent because not everybody wanted to be violent. Certainly the goal was not to be violent. But when we're looking at this part of the civil rights movement, these are people who were willing to stand up and push back. These were people who were tired of getting pushed around, and not that they were taking to violence just to be violent, but a lot of times these people were people who would fight back. And so we're going to look at the civil rights getting radical. So first of all, we have to understand that both in the North and the South, there is a culture of segregation. There are two different types of segregation out there. One known as de jure segregation. That is the Southern style of segregation. And this is segregation by law. This is Jim Crow laws. You know, if you go to the South, it is legally written into the laws that there should be a separation between African American and white Americans. De jure segregation is segregation that is mandated by law. The other type of segregation is what is known as de facto segregation. And this is the segregation we see more in the North. De facto segregation is not segregation by law. In most northern states, there are no laws that say you must segregate. There are no laws that say you must discriminate, or at least very few, depending on where you go. What there is in the North is a custom of discrimination, a custom of hatred. We know that during World War I, many African Americans in the Great Migration left the South to go to the North to take jobs working in factories, and they were looking for this perfect life up in the North, and we know that they were met with resistance. We looked even at our own city of Detroit at the racial tension that existed there, not because segregation was required by law, but because that was the custom. So even after you desegregate, it's going to be difficult to change the hearts and the minds of people. Just kind of general discussion. What do you think would be harder to eliminate, de facto or de jure? De facto, right? I mean, changing the laws, that's fairly easy to do. But changing the hearts and the minds of somebody, that takes time. We saw, of course, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the law was changed pretty quick. But we know that into the late 50s and early 60s, there are still some places where schools aren't desegregated, because changing the hearts and the minds of people is much harder to do. When we have de facto segregation, we've got to change the hearts and minds of people. And part of this starts with getting rid of the economic oppression. One of the major issues for African Americans, even in the North, and in parts of the South where Jim Crow laws were outlawed, we still have a huge sense of inequality between African Americans and white Americans. By the 1960s, most African Americans, even in the North, even in the better areas, were living in slums. We're living in neighborhoods that might remind you of tenements during the turn of the century. Maybe not huge apartment buildings, but houses with 2, 3, 4, 5 families living in them. Some houses without running water. Many of them cramped, many of them just in disrepair. And so this is harder to change. We can change a law that says you don't have to discriminate, that says you can't discriminate against African Americans, but trying to create a true sense of equality, that's harder to do. As you saw in the video, and as we'll continue to talk about, unemployment opportunities for African Americans, it was huge. There was twice the unemployment in the African American community than there was in the white community. People didn't want to hire African Americans if they didn't have to. And changing this discrimination is going to be a whole lot harder to do. Yes, in the North, there's no Jim Crow laws. There's nothing that says you have to be segregated. But changing that custom and getting white business owners to hire African Americans, that is going to be much more of a struggle. And so a big part of the civil rights movement is trying to create equality, true equality and opportunity, truly trying to get people an equal opportunity to be successful. We look at 1959, the number of people living in poverty, African Americans, about 56%, compared to at that same time period, only 16% of white people were living in poverty. Sometimes when we look back and we blame situations, we say, well, everybody was poor in the 1950s. Not the case. White people were living the good life in the 1960s, while there's still abject poverty for many African Americans. And so a big part of the civil rights movement, especially you heard at the end of the video, was this idea of creating equality, creating jobs. It's not just about doing away with Jim Crow laws, but it's trying to find a way to get African Americans hired so that they can support themselves. And a big advocate for African Americans was a guy named Malcolm X. And you've read a little bit about Malcolm X. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his background. You don't need to memorize it for the test or anything like that. But I think it helps to explain who Malcolm X, or Malcolm Little as he was originally known, who he is as a person. So just to start out with Malcolm X, his father was killed when Malcolm X was at a young age. His father was killed by white supremacists. He got himself into a little bit of a jam. Many were racist. They went off. They killed his dad, and as you can imagine, somebody killed your father. Somebody killed anybody in your family. It's probably going to make you a little bit more angry, a little bit more upset, a little bit more vigilant to what's going on, and you're going to want to stand up for yourself a little bit more. Without a father and in the condition of poverty, Malcolm Little made some pretty bad decisions. 1946, he was arrested. He was sent to jail for burglary. One of the reasons why he had to burglarize homes, he didn't really have much of a future. Not tons of formal education, segregated system, segregated world. This is a guy who tried to get a job, and he saw what was happening in the African American communities. He thought his only hope was a life of crime. He gets caught, he goes to jail, and this is really where his life changes around. Because when he is in jail, he starts studying from a guy named Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is the leader of a movement known as the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is a group that sometimes are nicknamed the Black Muslims. They are a group of people who practice the Islamic faith, predominantly African Americans who practice the Islamic faith, but they've also put their own sort of twist on the system of following this system of beliefs. And so when Malcolm X, or Malcolm Little as he was known at the time, when he goes to jail, he meets this leader of the Nation of Islam, and the Nation of Islam is speaking his language. The Nation of Islam teaches about peace. It teaches not about peace and nonviolence, but it teaches that the causes of oppression are the white man. That the white man is what is holding African Americans down. And so if we're going to end this oppression, peace and nonviolence, this stuff that Martin Luther King Jr. is preaching, it's not working. If we remember back to the turn of the century, Booker T. Washington was preaching the idea of peace and nonviolence. Let's just talk about this and do it gradually over time. And by this point in time, Elijah Muhammad, as well as Malcolm Little, believed that this is too much. Forget this waiting. We've got to do something, and we've got to do something now. And so a big part of what the Nation of Islam was talking about, and this is where we start to get into some of the stuff you should be more concerned with, is the idea of a separate lifestyle. Separate by choice, not separate by law. The Nation of Islam believed, look, we're never really going to truly get the equality that we want. And so African Americans should try to create their own communities and try to have an equal opportunity as far as jobs go, as far as creating a better life for people within their communities. Another thing that the Nation of Islam believes in is armed self-defense. That is, African Americans should be able to use weapons to defend themselves. If that means carrying around a gun, if that's what it takes to defend yourself, then that's what you've got to do. Obviously, this doesn't really jive well with Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X. By the way, Malcolm Little changed his name to Malcolm X when he converted to Islam. When he changes his name, he goes through this transformation, and a big thing that he really wants to do is stand up for the rights of African Americans. Honestly, I think if I were living during a time of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., I realized that Martin Luther King Jr. probably had the right approach. Peace and nonviolence and changing the hearts and the minds of people probably was the more successful way to go about things. Probably more likely to bring change. But I'll tell you, if I was living during the time of Malcolm X and if I were an African American at the time, I'd probably be more of a supporter of Malcolm X. I don't think I'd want to get pushed around anymore. I think I'd want to stand up for myself. And that's exactly what Malcolm X said.
This movement preaches a gospel of violence.
No, the black people in this country have been the victims of violence at the hands of the white man for 400 years. And following the ignorant Negro preachers, we had thought that it was godlike to turn the other cheek to the brute that was brutalizing us. And today, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is showing black people in this country that just as the white man and every other person on this earth has God-given rights, natural rights, civil rights, any kind of rights that you can think of when it comes to defending himself, black people should have the right to defend ourselves also. And because the Honorable Elijah Muhammad makes black people brave enough, men enough to defend ourselves no matter what the odds are, the white man runs around here with a doctrine that Mr. Muhammad is advocating violence when he's actually telling Negroes to defend themselves against violent people.
Well, Reverend Martin Luther King preaches a doctrine of nonviolent insistence upon the rights of the American Negro. What is your attitude toward this philosophy?
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's just the American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they've taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attack of the Klan in that day.
But the goal of Dr. King is full equality and full rights of citizenship for Negroes.
The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to give Negroes a chance to sit in a segregated restaurant beside the same white man who has brutalized them for 400 years. The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to get Negroes to forgive the people who have brutalized them for 400 years by lulling them to sleep and making them forgetting what those whites have done to them.
Pretty strong words. Again, I think it's important to note that Malcolm X wasn't preaching go out and be violent to be violent. He was preaching self-defense. That if you were unjustly attacked by a white man, then you did have the right to stand up, and you did have the right to defend yourself. He was teaching sometimes what we would call the idea of black supremacy, the idea that African Americans were equal to or maybe even superior to white people. Obviously, one of the things hopefully you're noticing is that Malcolm X was a very good public speaker. I think he is one of the most prolific public speakers because his message was a little bit more radical than Martin Luther King Jr. Probably doesn't get some of the credit that he deserves, but I mean, man, you just listen to this guy talk for hours. I mean, he really puts things in a way that African American and white people at the time can truly understand and truly grasp. I think he has a way with words of communicating to people.
So they will be peaceful and we will be peaceful. We are here to tell you to love the white man, you have come to the wrong place. And those of you who think that you perhaps keep here to hear us tell you to turn the other cheek to the brutality of the white man, I say again, you came to the wrong place. We don't teach you to turn the other cheek in the South, and we don't teach you to turn the other cheek in the North. We teach you to obey the law. We teach you to carry yourselves in a respectable way. But at the same time, we teach you that anyone who puts his hand on you, do your best to see that he doesn't put it on anybody else.
Probably more my type of action, right? You hit me, and we hit you back. One of the things that Malcolm X encouraged was that African Americans take control of their lives, take control of their communities. Don't let white people push you around. Don't let anybody push you around. You gotta fight for yourself. You gotta fight for your people, for your culture, to have a job. I think a big thing that Malcolm X was emphasizing is the idea that all African Americans should have the opportunity to earn an equal livelihood to that of white people. That doesn't mean that necessarily everybody has to have equal pay and let's turn to communism. But he firmly believed that black people needed opportunities to try to compete with white people for jobs. That African Americans should be able to self-sustain themselves. He believed that there was enough black culture, enough African American culture to the point where we don't need integration the way that maybe others wanted it. He believed in black culture in and of itself. And he believed that black people should be proud of their culture. In March of 1964, guys, please stop packing up. In March of 1964, Malcolm X made the Hajj. He made the trip to Mecca. And when he was there, the one thing that he realized, the one thing that he saw, was that African Americans, white Americans, people of all different races, all different cultures came to Mecca, and they were able to worship in peace and harmony. And that was something that he really took away from it, and maybe took a little bit of the edge off of Malcolm X as he made the Hajj. This is really where he started to think, well, you know, it's true that African Americans need to stand up for themselves, but he started to rethink his way that African Americans should stand up. And it was, well, he was on the Hajj, while he was making the trip to Mecca, and he came up with his famous Ballot or the Bullet speeches. And so this is the speech. One of the things that we see, if you remember in the election of 1960, one of the things that helped JFK win the election was that he promised to help African Americans. If you remember, that election was very close between Nixon and JFK. JFK won by an extremely small margin, and a lot of people think that that small margin was from African Americans who came out to vote for JFK because JFK promised to help African Americans. Unfortunately, we mentioned that early on in his career, JFK didn't do a whole lot to help African Americans. He wanted to, but he understood that it was such a political struggle that if he were to continue to fight, that it might cost him votes, especially in the South. And so JFK, in the early part of his career, really up until the March on Washington, JFK had kind of taken the approach that we'll get to it eventually, but we can't do this right now. And a lot of African Americans felt betrayed by him. We'll talk about that betrayal tomorrow. Have a great day. All right, good people of the world. As we head into the weekend, you probably won't have homework this weekend. There's a worksheet called the Detroit Riots Musical Analysis. It will be due, I don't know, whenever we get to it. So you don't have to do that for homework or anything. I think where we last left off, we were talking about how the civil rights movement was getting radical. We were talking about how we're moving more and more away from the peaceful nonviolent side of the civil rights movement, although that's still going on. So while we're talking about all the radical side of the civil rights movement, the peaceful nonviolent side is also going on. There are sort of these separate factions of the civil rights movement. Half the people are preaching peace and nonviolence, and others are preaching, I don't want to say a violent approach, because that's probably the wrong way to look at it, but more of a confrontational approach, more of a let's stand up for ourselves and fight back approach. and probably the biggest proponent of this stand up for yourself kind of approach is a guy named Malcolm X, originally known as Malcolm Little, eventually changed his name after making the Hajj, after converting to Islam. And so Malcolm X gave a famous speech right here in Detroit called the Ballot or the Bullet speech. I think we were mentioning yesterday as the bell was ringing that in the election of 1960, a really close election between JFK and Richard Nixon, and really the big factor that sort of put JFK over the edge, that really helped JFK win the election, was the idea that he appealed to African Americans. He had promised that he was going to work on civil rights, and so a lot of African Americans said, hey, this is our kind of guy, we're going to vote for him. Unfortunately for the African American community, JFK was still also, after he got elected, worried about pleasing the Southern Democrats who weren't so keen on civil rights. And so even though JFK personally wanted to get a lot of the civil rights legislation passed, as time went on, he kind of made everything else a priority. And he kind of ignored African Americans in the civil rights movement. He wouldn't fight Congress hard enough to get those things passed. And that eventually leads to Malcolm X's famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, where Malcolm X says that African Americans are really at this turning point. He is first going to call out JFK. He's going to call out other politicians who made promises to the African American community that they would fix things, that they would make things better, that they would fight for civil rights. Now they're not doing it. And then he's, of course, going to say that African Americans have two options to make change in society. And those options will be the ballot or the bullet.
You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the Washington, D.C. It was the fact that you 8% of the vote behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be a determining factor, whether you get out, the Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And they're all part of the equation. They wanted to bring up, they brought it up and got it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first and they put you last. Because you're a sheriff. The party that you pass controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives in the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you. Because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it gave to you during election time, and you are dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race. You're playing a con game. A political con game. You know how it goes. One of them comes to you and makes things for you. And you look at who's for the other and the not for you. Right, because neither one of them is for you. The enemy can go with one or the other. So this is a con game.
Pretty powerful words where he's calling out other African Americans. You're a traitor to your race. And he's calling African Americans to action. He's saying, look, you got to do something. We can't just sit by and let white people continue to push us around. They keep making promises that they're going to fix things for us, but at the end of the day, nothing's happening. No change is taking place. And so Malcolm X is finally starting to say, look, African Americans, let's wake up. Let's realize what we're doing, and let's start to fight for our rights.
It'll be the ballot. And if you're not ready to pay the price, don't use the word freedom in your vocabulary.
Don't use the word freedom in your vocabulary.
The message, of course, of Malcolm X is you got to go out and vote for people who actually represent you, and hold those politicians accountable. Don't let them continue to make these promises. And if politicians keep making promises and they don't keep them, then we've got to turn towards something a little bit more drastic. Now, Malcolm X is not advocating violence. He does not want violence, but he's not afraid to use it if that's what it takes. He tells African Americans they need to start standing up for themselves, fighting back, and not let themselves get pushed around by white people. And so that's a huge part of his ballot for the Bullet speech. I think Malcolm X was pretty, one of his best quotes is, "Nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it." He's saying, look, we've got to stand up for ourselves. We've got to stand up against the politicians and against white people in general who keep pushing us around. It's time now for you and me to become more politically mature and realize what the ballot is for, what we're supposed to get when we cast a ballot. And that if we don't cast a ballot, it's going to end up in a situation where we're going to have to cast a bullet. Either it's a ballot or a bullet. Again, this idea that things aren't going to turn out well if we can't make the political system work for us. Unfortunately for Malcolm X, on February 21st, 1965, he was giving a speech in Harlem, New York. Remember that city where the Harlem Renaissance took place? And unfortunately, he was assassinated. Malcolm X would, ironically, take a bullet. So, 1965. You won't need to know that, but just to kind of give you a framework of where we stand and sort of the time frame. Ironically, it wasn't white people that took Malcolm X out. It wasn't the police that took Malcolm X out. It was other people in the Nation of Islam. There were a lot of people vying for control of the Nation of Islam. A lot of factions starting to form within that group, and some of the people didn't like the direction that Malcolm X was taking the group, and eventually he was assassinated. So that puts an end to Malcolm X's career as a speaker, and of course his life as well. Malcolm X really triggered what eventually gets known as the Black Power movement, and we're gonna look at a number of different aspects of the Black Power movement. The idea that African Americans should start standing up for themselves. Well, let's not get pushed around anymore by the white people. We need to stand up for ourselves, and we need to start to do things for ourselves. And one of the earliest pioneers of the Black Power movement was a guy named James Meredith. James Meredith was a particularly well-educated African American. Not that you need to know it, but he was the first African American to graduate from Ole Miss University. Mississippi, probably one of the most segregated places in the world at the time. Probably one of the most segregated places in the world still to this day. And Ole Miss was one of those universities that was very hesitant to let African Americans in. James Meredith overcame. He got in. Not only did he get in, he graduated. And James Meredith will eventually lead a 225-mile march called the March Against Fear. The March Against Fear. And his plan is to walk on his own. So he doesn't want huge rallies or anything like that. He's going to walk on his own from Memphis, Tennessee, all the way to Jackson, Mississippi. And his goal is to prove that an African American can walk through one of the most segregated places in America and do it safely. He wanted to show peaceful, nonviolent protest. He wanted to raise awareness for the fear that all African Americans have to endure on a daily basis. So he's going to begin his march. And when he begins his march, this is what happens.
James Meredith walks down the road in his native Mississippi. He calls it a march against fear. The daily fear that lives with every black man in his native Mississippi. He calls it a march against fear. The daily fear that lives with every black man in the South.
Ain't nobody gonna get me now.
He gets shot. You didn't catch that when he's like, I am hit. He fell. Hit me in the leg, not the head. So he could continue on. He doesn't want to give up. There's a white supremacist group, essentially a branch of the KKK. The guy drives by and shoots James Meredith in the leg, but James Meredith doesn't want to give up. He doesn't want to quit. He wants to keep fighting. wants to keep the good fight. He wants to keep his walk going. Unfortunately, if you've been shot in the leg, it's good that you didn't die, but you're not going to be able to continue your 225-mile walk. So James Meredith would have to discontinue his walk against fear. And this is where things get really crazy, and this is where things get really awkward, because he can't continue. The civil rights movement is going to once again be divided by this event. There are two different groups out there, two different camps out there that want to continue the mission of James Meredith, that want to continue his walk, that want to continue what he is fighting for. The problem is they've got very, very different ideas on how to do that. One group is the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What approach are they going to take? Peaceful protest, nonviolent. Other groups like CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this is sort of the breaking point for them. This is the point where they say we need to take a more aggressive stance on what we're doing. These are the people who are a little bit more violent than better. Now remember, SNCC was originally founded by white and black people, by African Americans and white people wanting to work together, kids in college and university wanting to work together for change. But by this point in time, by the late 60s, progress isn't as quick as many of them would have liked. Bless you. Things are not going as well as many of them would have liked, and eventually, many of them, especially after James Meredith is just making this one-man march across the state of Mississippi, and he gets shot. That's when people say, we've got to do something a little bit differently. We've got to change our approach. We've got to do something that's a little bit more aggressive than just sitting there and taking it. And so both of these groups would sing chants as they were finishing the march. The SCLC would sing, and CORE and SNCC would sing, we shall overrun. So instead of we shall overcome, we shall overrun. This is, again, one of those dividing points in history where everybody's sort of on the same path, everybody wants the same outcome, everybody wants the same goal, but now the groups are starting to split. The civil rights movement is starting to get more radical. The civil rights movement is starting to become more aggressive. There were people like Stokely Carmichael who believed in the idea of the Black Power movement as well. He gave a famous speech in Michigan State in 1967, and he said this is a call for black people to begin to define their own goals and to lead their own organizations. Carmichael believed that, again, this idea that white and black people were working together for the civil rights movement, groups like especially SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, it's just not getting it done. This whole let's work together thing is not working. African Americans need to take control of their own lives and continue to fight for themselves. To bring about a more immediate, a more abrupt change, instead of kind of taking things slowly over time, we need to get things done much more immediately. And so one thing that Carmichael was calling for is for SNCC to stop working with white people, stop recruiting white students to join SNCC. He believed that it should be just an African American led movement. Of course, MLK didn't agree with the Black Power movement. He didn't agree with what Carmichael was calling for. MLK, once again, is starting to think the other side of things. But whether you like it or not, you've got to work with white people if you want to have true change. If you really want to achieve your goals, if you really want that change in society, you're going to have to work with white people. And if you're starting to say we don't want white people in our group, that's only going to antagonize them more. That's only going to irritate them more, and it's only going to lead to more of a divide. One of the defining moments of the Black Power movement was the 1968 Olympics. In the 1968 Olympics, African American not only wins the gold medal, but Tommy Smith ends up winning, setting the world record for the 200-meter race. And when he won, his goal, along with John Carlos, was to put his hand up as a sign of protest. Put his hand up as a sign of protest and as a sign of the Black Power movement. And so the clenched fist is the symbol of the Black Power movement. It's a pretty famous event in American history and really world history, because he was irritated at the way that African Americans were treated. There's sort of this double standard. He says, if I win, I'm an American, not a black American. But if I did something bad, then they would say I am a Negro. We are black and we are proud of being black. Black America will understand what we did tonight. And he raises a very good point. Unfortunately, one that maybe even speaks truth to this day. We look at people, we honor people, we're proud of Americans who win medals and who win the gold medal and who participate in athletics for our country. But yet, when it comes to the overall sign on the streets, people are treated much differently. I think that's with the kneeling during the national anthem during NFL games, it's kind of the same message that they're trying to send, right? So African American players are saying, look, yeah, here you respect me when I'm on the football field. But the minute I get into average everyday society, I'm not treated like the hero that I am on the football field. And trying to bring attention, using sports as a platform to bring attention to the issues, nothing new, happened in 1968, and it will probably happen again.